I'm glad to welcome all of you to this webinar about how companies best can support climate action beyond their value chain. It's a very hot topic. We got lots of people that have registered for this event. And it's very clear that companies do play a very important role in solving the climate crisis. And besides reducing their emissions and setting targets for that and starting to implement measures, it's also clear that companies can finance climate action outside their own value chains. But there's been a lot of uncertainty around how that can be done in the best way, especially since the paradigm around offsetting is starting to shake a bit and being questioned by more and more actors. But there's no real new winner that have emerged yet for how companies can support climate action. And the science-based targets net zero standard, for example, set a standard that companies have to reduce their emissions with 90% first before they can claim net zero and use permanent carbon removal for the rest. But there's also talk about something called beyond value chain mitigations and incentivizing companies to support various types of climate action in the run-up to net zero. So this is the topic for the day. And this webinar is arranged by the impact platform Milkywire, by Stockholm Environmental Institute, and by World Wildlife Fund US. And my name is Robert Höglund. I'm a climate advisor. Work with Milkywire, managing something called the Climate Transformation Fund that tries to support different types of climate action to reach global net zero. And together we have a very strong group of speakers and panelists with us. And several were also part of the Science-Based Targets Net Zero Expert Advisory Group that helped develop the standard and sort of discussing these questions a lot. And today we'll discuss then how can companies contribute to climate action beyond their value chains? How much should they contribute? To what type of projects? What claims can companies make, and how can these kind of contributions be incentivized so that it actually happens? And among our participants, we have Brad Shallert, who is the director of carbon market governance and aviation at World Wildlife Fund US. And he's also one of the architects behind the WWF Blueprint for corporate climate action that I will be presenting. We have Scarlett Benson as an associate at Systemic, who has done research on the different kinds of options that companies have when supporting beyond value chain mitigation for the SBTI that she'll be presenting. We have Derek Brokoff, who's a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, who's been working on carbon markets and greenhouse gas accounting for decades, and he will start out with talking about net zero on a global level. Carol Gobczynski is head of climate and energy at the Inca Group and IKEA as a panelist. And IKEA has been a leading actor in climate and doing also a lot of financing of external climate projects as well. And Sarah Lugers, who's the chief strategy officer for Gold Standard. And Gold Standard is a very important actor in these issues. Has been doing a lot of thinking on sort of how this whole new paradigm can be created. And Janek Kose, head of climate at the fintech Klarna, who is one of the companies that have adopted the WWF Blueprint. And Emily Tai, a manager at Giving Green, who has been doing research on sort of what are the most effective types of climate projects that can be supported, and how what kind of categories can companies and individuals support. So we're going to start out with 3 presentations, whereas we move over to a panel discussion, and at the end also a Q&A with the audience. And the webinar is being recorded. It will be shared afterwards, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end, but feel free to write your questions in the Q&A during the event. So with those words, we'll move on to the first presenter. So Derek, you could share your screen.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Let me find the right screen here. Does that look good?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. So I'm going to kick things off with some context here. So kind of the big picture and kind of why we're having this conversation right now. So, you know, since the Paris Agreement, certainly within the last couple of years, this idea of achieving net zero emissions has become the guide star, I would say, for climate action generally, certainly for voluntary climate action, including at the corporate level. But globally, this is, you know, there's a consensus, I think, that this is where we need to get to by the middle of the century. So reducing emissions as much as possible. And of course, there's big questions around what that means, but also balancing or counterbalancing whatever emissions remain around the middle of the century with removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I think in general, this is a good thing, right? The concept has had its detractors, at least folks raising concerns about, is this a useful kind of benchmark for climate action in particular? You know, does it lead to too much of a focus on long-term targets or too much emphasis on the net part, the removal part, as opposed to reducing emissions? But I think as a kind of general, you know, a condensation of where we need to get to, net zero has a lot of traction. But of course, this changes some things, right? So compared to how we thought about corporate climate action in particular in the past, this new framing, I think, raises some new questions about what is meaningful corporate climate action. And in particular, you know, what is the role of what we're talking about today, what you might call external mitigation. It used to be called offsetting. But as Robert mentioned, there's some ferment here, I would say, around, you know, what it is exactly that we're talking about. So in short, right, we had this old model, at least for the voluntary carbon markets, where basically offsetting, investing in mitigation outside your value chain was treated as a form of cost-effective mitigation. So in the classic setting, certainly in a regulatory context, you would have your business as usual emissions. You might set a target for reducing those emissions. But the idea was it didn't really matter as far as the atmosphere was concerned, whether you reduced your value chain emissions or your direct emissions to achieve that target, or you paid someone else to reduce emissions and counted those emission reductions or removals towards your target. That's this model on the left here. With the idea being that you would reduce your own emissions, you know, up to the point where it was cost effective to do so compared to what that external price was for carbon offsetting. Another common model here was, you know, carbon neutrality. I think maybe still is, right? This idea that you just offset all your emissions and you can claim to be carbon neutral. And again, cost effectiveness kind of ruled the day in terms of deciding how much you're going to reduce your own emissions versus purchase offsets to counterbalance whatever emissions remained. This idea on the right-hand side. And I think what's changed today with the concept of net zero, again, there's this emphasis on, yes, we need to balance out emissions by the middle of the century, but really what the world needs is to reduce emissions urgently and rapidly in the near term. And so there's this emphasis on this idea of a mitigation hierarchy. And this was, of course, I think spearheaded to a large degree by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, this idea of focusing on your value chain, reducing emissions within your value chain in line with a science-based target. So in line with, you know, paralleling what it would take at a global level to get to 1.5 degrees. And then, of course, the idea is still there that you need to neutralize your emissions, but it raises these open questions about what is the role of mitigation outside your value chain, maybe it's no longer offsetting anymore within the context of corporate climate action? Are we really only talking about what's on the left-hand side here, which is neutralizing your emissions around mid-century? Should you be looking at counterbalancing or offsetting all of your emissions on the way to that net zero target? What are we talking about here? So there's some questions in play, I would say, within Science-Based Targets Initiative, but certainly more generally, what is it that we're talking about? Are we talking about offsetting anymore? Is that really the right concept to be applied here? Especially when external mitigation is in addition to, not in lieu of, value chain mitigation. So we're no longer looking at cost effectiveness, but doing something above and beyond what it would take to reduce your value chain emissions. And if that's the case, is the goal really to compensate for your remaining value chain emissions, or is it something else perhaps? And along with these questions, what does it mean to achieve net zero emissions at a corporate level? Does that mean balance your emissions with removals, regardless of when and how that occurs? So it could be next year, it could be in 10 years, it could be mid-century. Or when we're talking about net zero, does that mean only the long-term target and that long-term balancing of emissions and removals? And I think sort of lurking around all these questions is this question of whether achieving net zero emissions at a corporate level is the right framing and benchmark for climate action. So part of the context here is, how should we think about net zero? Is it a corporate goal? Is it a global goal? And I would argue, well, it's useful to think about net zero at a corporate level. We should keep our eyes on the prize, which is, this is a global goal to which all countries, all subnational non-state actors need to aspire. So think of corporate net zero as a journey, not an endpoint necessarily. And I think we should think about reframing the objectives for what you might call beyond value chain mitigation, right? So the old idea was carbon offsetting, carbon neutrality. The new framing might be, are my efforts aligned with achieving global net zero? Instead of focusing just on balancing emissions with removals, thinking of, am I investing in an appropriate mix of mitigation activities aligned with a safe climate globally? Rather than think about how can I compensate for or offset my emissions, how can I contribute to an equitable, fair share of mitigation outside my value chain? So again, it's reframing what the role of that external mitigation is, and looking at which mitigation investments might have the highest value in terms of advancing global goals rather than what's most cost effective from an offsetting standpoint. So this is obviously an ongoing conversation. That's why we wanted to hold this talk today. But I think this net zero framing raises a lot of these questions about what it is that we're up to. And so with that, I will turn it over to Brad Shallot.
Great. Thanks very much, Derek. Nice to be with you all today. And so I'm going to present the Corporate Climate Mitigation Blueprint. This is a framework that WWF developed in 2020. We released it at the end of 2020. And it really looks at that sort of global framing that Derek was talking about. When we created this framework, we asked this question, how can a company structure a climate mitigation strategy that it delivers the most benefit for nature, climate, and people, right? So what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of the background for why we, the questions that we were trying to answer as part of this framework. I'll introduce you to the framework, and with a particular focus on the beyond value chain mitigation portion of the blueprint. So when we were starting this process of creating this now almost a year and a half ago, we were looking at all of these newer commitments that were coming out from corporates, and there are quite a few coming out, but it was really difficult to differentiate between them, right? Because they will often carry these headline claims of carbon neutral, net zero, climate positive, et cetera. And it's hard to sort out what's below the surface, right? So we really wanted to make sure that we were giving guidance to companies in this new era relating to this new paradigm that Derek was talking about. So for example, I mean, if you look at two different companies, right, and so one here and one here, which one is more carbon neutral? I mean, they're technically both carbon neutral here, right? But the one on the left, it's allowing emissions to rise and compensating for them along the way, kind of taking that cost-effective approach that Derek was talking about. And then there's the other approach on the right here, which implements the mitigation hierarchy, right? So the business is avoiding emissions, it's reducing emissions, it's setting a science-based target, it's even doing restoration of lands if it's a company that has land-based emissions in its value chain. There's less compensation that happens along the way, but this is probably the more ideal outcome that we would want to see from a company. So the mitigation hierarchy is really important and embedded within the blueprint. The other thing that we were noticing is that there's just been this preoccupation with individual footprint goals over the years. And it's not saying that individual goals aren't important, that carbon accounting is important and that sort of thing. But we really feel that companies should be looking at this in a forward-looking way, right? Thinking about the investments it needs to be making now in order to be part of the net zero economy of the future, which is going to be lower emissions, right? It's going to be fundamentally lower emissions. This little incremental change over time is not going to get us there. There's also been a strong focus on, especially in beyond value chain mitigation goals of ex post CO2 mitigation outcomes. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean about this. There's been such a focus on offsets or carbon credits that the challenge here is that's only a subset of the potential mitigation solutions that companies can be spending money on. For example, in the third point here, you could be spending money on R&D. You could be investing in enabling conditions. And these are really, really important things if we're going to get the systems transformation that we think about. We can't just be looking at things that fit the carbon finance or carbon credit model, right? And then there's this issue of double claiming of voluntary carbon credits. And for those of you that have been following this debate over the years, it's been really raging for about 7 years now. You'll understand what I mean, but I'll give a quick crash course in what I'm talking about here. In the Paris Agreement, there's Article 6, that's the carbon markets provision of the Paris Agreement. It says that double claiming of carbon credits or mitigation outcomes needs to be avoided. Now, if countries are trading with each other, that is where, say, for example, Switzerland buys a carbon credit from Uganda. Uganda can't be claiming that carbon credit at the same time, right? That would be double claiming. The challenge is when there's a company that's buying the carbon credit, that's where things are a little bit more ambiguous. So if we think about, let's say the largest company in the world, Apple, buying a carbon credit from Uganda, does that accounting adjustment need to happen or not, right? So some would say yes, that there does need to be that double claiming avoided, that only one entity should be claiming that carbon credit. And related to that the claims of carbon neutrality that, say, Apple or another company would be making using that carbon credit, if there's not an accounting adjustment that happens on the Uganda side, that claim is less truthful, right? Now, on the other side of that equation, some say no, that avoiding double claiming is irrelevant or unimportant. So the UN carbon accounting system and the voluntary corporate carbon accounting system, they're separate, and some think that they should not interact. Some think that requiring avoidance of double counting might actually stifle carbon finance. So this is just a quick crash course in this issue. And the nice thing about the blueprint, I think, is that it avoids this altogether. Like this has been a debate that's been raging forever. I'm not sure if it will ever get fully resolved. The nice thing is that the blueprint avoids this, and we can talk a little bit about why that happens later in the Q&A, perhaps, if there's interest. So again, this is sort of a summary of what I just said. The blueprint implements the mitigation hierarchy. It does incentivize high quality carbon credits, the highest quality, we think. It integrates nature-based solutions. And it enables credible claims. Here is the blueprint here. It's characterized by 4 main steps. So account, disclose your emissions. Number 2 is effectively set a science-based target and achieve it. And then the third and fourth is where I think the real innovation of the blueprint comes in. It's moving away from this offsetting or compensation model. And what happens here is that the company looks at its remaining emissions, it quantifies the financial commitment it will provide to projects beyond its value chain, and will use a carbon price that will basically tax those remaining emissions. And it will generate a certain amount of revenue, and in step 4, that is where that funding can be spent. So it can be spent beyond the value chain, but actually we think that it can be spent within the value chain too. So that's what this further emissions reduction box means here within number 4. That would go back into the value chain, maybe allow it to go beyond its science-based target even. But there's other types of climate solutions here. I won't go into a lot of detail because I think the panelists may be talking about this more, but it includes things like investing in enabling conditions. So let's say you could invest in a project that enables better land tenure among farmers that are next to a landscape that's being deforested. So that doesn't necessarily deliver an immediate climate mitigation benefit, but it could really fundamentally change the system around that area, right? I would also just quickly note that this is a holistic framework. We're thinking about policy, we're thinking about collaboration and companies building resilience as well. It's not just about how the company is spending money and reducing its own emissions. So what are the main benefits of this new approach in steps 3 and 4? Well, we think that there are a few. One is that we think it encourages companies to look broader than just the current set of solutions that are in the voluntary carbon market. And actually that it could incentivize just different types of investments within the voluntary carbon market as well. It can establish a race to the top based on the company that applies the highest carbon price. So if one company is applying a $20 a ton carbon price and another is using a $30 a ton carbon price, the $30 a ton company gets bragging rights, right? And we think it can create further incentives for value chain emissions reductions, because this carbon price, it's basically a trade-off between reducing your own emissions or spinning outside of your value chain. So it actually incentivizes more value chain emissions reductions potentially for companies. And again, we still think it encourages the use of credits, but better credits that might include more co-benefits. And we think we've answered all the questions with the blueprint. This is just a high-level framework. And one of the biggest questions is, what is the right carbon price that a company should use in step 3? Is it the social cost of carbon? Should different business units within a company use a different carbon price? Should all industries use the same carbon price? I think Scarlett's going to go into this in a little bit more detail. And then finally, one of the bigger questions is what to invest in. And I think as well within the panel, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Scarlett here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brad. Let me fiddle with the technology for 1 second. Right. Can everybody see? I guess that's a yes. I can't actually see anyone. Perfect.
Not yet.
Awesome. So hi, nice to meet you all. My name is
Sorry,
Scarlett
we
Benson.
only see you, not the presentation.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Ah, how weird. Okay, yes. Now?
No.
Yep, okay. Yeah, hi everybody, my name is Scarlett, I work for Systemic, and we recently worked with the SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, helping them think through their strategy as it relates to beyond value chain mitigation. So this is a graph that probably quite a few of you have seen already if you've looked at the SBTI's net zero standard. And it really articulates what what we've already heard today about the fact that net zero is, in the SBTI's definition, it is about deep decarbonization in the order of 90%, neutralization of residual emissions at mid-century, and essentially there's this sort of third optional part of the SBTI standard, which is around beyond value chain mitigation. So to be net zero, you have to achieve 1, 2, and 4, which is both a near-term emissions reduction target, a long-term, i.e. before 2050 reduction target, and then the neutralization of whatever's left at the end. But there's this third thing, as I say, that is optional, and I'm going to talk you through a little bit of the options around how the SBTI or others might be able to think about this in the future. Maybe just a caveat, the report that we've provided to them is more kind of, we did a landscape review, we spoke to lots of experts, we did a survey with about 300 respondents, including 150 companies. So what we've put together is more kind of advice as opposed to necessarily anything that the SBTI is planning to do. I cannot speak on their behalf. So there's these 3 approaches to beyond value chain mitigation, or BBCM. And you can see here, I've actually very purposely tried to take language out when I'm describing what these are. So there's, as I think we probably already anticipated, there's quite a lot of confusing terms in this space. You have compensation, you have counterbalancing, you have financial contributions, you have offsetting, and people are using those terms often in slightly different ways. So instead, what we've done is we've actually just described very clearly what the activity is. So the first approach that a company could take is they follow this idea of a ton for a ton. So when you are going along your science-based emissions reduction target on the journey to net zero, you purchase and retire carbon credits, or you finance some sort of emissions reduction outside of your value chain, based on how many emissions you have left in that given year. So if you have 100 tons left, you would buy or you would finance 100 tons of mitigation elsewhere. The dollar for ton is slightly different, and this is very much aligned to the WWF Blueprint, which is around dollar for ton. So you've got your remaining 100 tons of emissions, and then you apply a social cost of carbon to determine an annual financial investment. And you would then target that in various different ways. As Brad said, it could be in carbon credits, but it could also be in R&D, or it could be in capacity building within a country. And then the third approach is a dollar for dollar approach. It's a percentage of profits being allocated to finance. 1.5% was an idea, and there is some maths behind that. But yeah, so that's fairly straightforward. Each of these approaches have quite different pros and cons. And what we found through interviewing lots of experts and engaging with companies on this topic is that between 1 and 2, people are quite split. There is no very clear consensus about which one of these approaches is the best. The third approach is is less kind of well known, or has been thought of less. But equally, there's no very clear consensus on which of these is the best way to go. But what gets really interesting is when you start to look at how much spending is enough. So with each of those different approaches, if you go back actually, you could be a ton for ton. Are you just looking at scopes 1 and 2, or are you looking at scopes 1, 2, and 3? Are you also including historic emissions? Dollar for ton could be, again, what level of emissions are you applying it to? What social cost of carbon are you applying it to? And then, what percentage of profit is enough? So we have, that is really a key question when we're thinking about the claims that companies can make. So I'll very quickly just touch on some of the pros and cons of these different approaches to defining how much is enough. So the first approach you could you could use as, or the first method, sorry, is around the polluter pays. So you're assuming that the company is essentially paying for the cost of their pollution. Now that is much more aligned with the dollar for ton approach, which is based on a social cost of carbon, which is inherently taking into account the price, the cost of that pollution to society. There are issues with this, of course, how to pay for, like how to work out what that social cost of carbon is. Potentially, as we'll see later, the social cost of carbon is often very high. So some companies may not even be able to generate sufficient profit to compensate for the damage that they're causing, which is a very interesting and scary thought in and of itself. Another approach is around economic capacity to pay or ability to pay. So in this approach, you might take into account which sectors have higher cost of abating their own emissions. So, you know, oil and gas or other harder to abate sectors, it's going to be very costly for them to achieve net zero. And therefore, you know, maybe they have less requirement to engage us beyond value chain mitigation. But obviously, you know, that often doesn't take into account the fact that some of those sectors have had the biggest impact to date. The third approach is what climate needs, which is obviously the best one in theoretically, but it would be impossible to determine almost. So you would have to essentially look at kind of what NDCs, you know, government nationally determined contributions are in place, what science-based targets are already in place, and which emissions globally are not being tackled by other parties. And then you divide them by the cohort of companies that are engaging in beyond value chain mitigation. I think that's obviously not going to be something that would really work. And then the last one is around what business would accept. So this is quite difficult because it's very hard to justify it as being science-based, but it is going to be a very important consideration what companies will be able to accept. And I'll go into that in a moment, actually, because the costs associated with these different approaches are like quite radically different. So as you can see, I've just listed the three approaches, and what I've done in blue on the right-hand side is I've shown if those costs were applied to just scope 1 and 2, what would the cost be? And this is a sort of made up company, but the orders of magnitude between the emissions and the revenue and profit is about right. And essentially with ton for ton, if you're only covering scope 1 and 2 and you're assuming a $3 carbon price, carbon credits are around $3 to $5 on the market today, obviously much more for the higher integrity ones, but this would be kind of what you could essentially achieve this at as little as $3 million or 0.06% of profit. So that's not really generating significant finance for climate. So, you know, maybe that's not really ambitious enough. But obviously then when you include scope 3, it's much more significant, in the order of 50 million a year. Dollar for ton, when you start to look at social costs of carbon, you're going much higher, 640 million a year for scopes 1 to 3, 13% of profit. We really do need to question whether companies would ever accept that in absence of regulation, of course. And then dollar for dollar. So you just set it as a standard percentage. And 1.5% was something that we did some maths on, and we thought that was very ambitious, but it wasn't completely crazy. So let's see. And so this is my last slide, actually, but I just wanted to indicate these different costs obviously have very important impacts for the businesses that are you know, incurring those costs, but actually sort of flipping it around and also looking at the potential of these different approaches for increasing climate finance. So don't worry about looking at the table in great detail. We'll send the slides around afterwards and you can actually have a look at the numbers. But what I did was I took the SBTI companies. I had from their 2020 report, I had the kind of emissions of those companies. I extrapolated them to kind of take into account that many more companies had joined onto the SBTI in the last year. And basically, if you look at the $40 a ton, so the social cost of carbon using the dollar for ton approach, you could generate in total 114 billion of carbon finance from the SBTI cohort. If we, at the other end of the scale, looked at the dollar for the ton for ton approach, then at $3 a ton, you're looking at more like 852 million in total. So basically, very big difference in terms of the costs, the revenue the potential to increase climate finance. One really interesting stat, I was looking this up the other day, the amount of carbon finance, sorry about this one, the amount of carbon finance that's currently going into the system, 114 billion would represent an increase in global carbon finance, climate finance by 20%, which is pretty exciting. So all that is to say, I think we have a lot to think about in terms of which of these approaches is going to be acceptable to business, but also generate significant finance to deal with the incredibly important challenge of societal net zero. And that is it from me.
Thank you very much, Scarlett and Derek and Brad. All very interesting presentations, as we can see from the questions that are coming in and also in the chat. So one question that we sort of didn't ask when arranging this webinar, but that could be good to start off with, is just to touch base on why companies should contribute to external climate action. Why isn't it enough for them to just reduce their own emissions? Let's just start with that question to anyone who feels that they want to jump in, and then we'll move on with the questions to everyone on the panel.
I can go, I think, then.
Yeah, good girl.
Carol, leading climate and energy within Inca Group. And I think why, first of all, it's very important to acknowledge that net zero standards gives a lot of trust and clarity what is the net zero goal, which is like super important milestone. And then when it comes to going to the question why it's important to take action beyond the value chain, because we know that companies can play, for example, important role when it comes to regulatory changes and influencing and giving confidence to decision makers, for example. So that's one of the actions on going beyond, which needs to be taken by the company to advocate for much more inclusive and enabling net zero transition regulations. The other part is that looking from the value chain perspective of the company which is facing customers, we can reduce the value chain emissions, but we can as well engage our customers to reduce further emissions at their homes and provide solutions which are enabling additional reduction of the emissions at home. For example, like offering home solar solutions or offering the food saving solutions, which is then not part of the value chain emissions, but is enabling further reduction of the emissions within society, bringing it closer to meet the net zero goal. And then the third part, it's about financing. We know that financing is very important to reduce, to become net zero society. And that's where companies can use their profits and the revenues to finance additional actions or transition and scaling up of the solutions, or investing in innovation in completely new models, which will enable the transition beyond the value chain.
Thank you, Carol. And that's an excellent answer. And thanks for touching upon the other areas where companies can engage as well, beyond just reducing and financing. Those are also very important. I wish we could cover it all in one webinar. So we heard a bit from WWF on their blueprint, and Janek Kosa at Klarna. Klarna is one of the companies that have adopted the blueprint, where you also support a fund of climate solutions hosted by Milkywire. So it'd be great to hear a little bit about you describing what the approach is and sort of why you chose that, and also the reactions that the Klarna have been getting.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining us today. I think we already have heard a bit about this in the entry presentation, but at Klarna, we clearly saw the need to take accountability for our total value chain emissions, both upstream and downstream of our value chain. And while we strive to be leaders in this space, we began to understand that taking responsibility for our own emissions was not enough to meet the scale of transformation needed. And instead of narrowing down our actions toward reaching targets for our own sake, we decided to commit meaningful resources to help positively impact the climate based on imposing an internal carbon tax upon ourselves. And so I think we already seen the blueprint, but I walk you through that one more time with Klarna as an example. So first of all, we committed to decarbonization of our total value chain emissions by 50% until 2030. And secondly, we really wanted to create transparency among our peers on what are our climate impacts year by year. And you can see this in today's published ESG report. And then thirdly, we introduced an internal carbon pricing mechanism, and we are taxing $100 per scope 1 and 2 emissions, and also per business travel emissions. And for the rest of our scope 3 emissions, we are taxing $10. And with that money that we gather through that tax, we are investing this money into high quality projects together with Milkywire. And because we have now heard a little bit about the finance gap we see in the broader support of climate projects, I think at Klarna, we also wanted to really address an impact gap that we have seen. And so what we are striving for each and every year is really to deploy the capital at the right time and the right places and in sufficient volumes, so that we are really steering towards global net zero. And we're doing this, as you said, Robert, together with Milkywire and the Climate Transformation Fund.
Great. Did you get any reactions, or sort of how has this landed among your customers or peers?
I think the feedback we received so far was very, very good. I think we are also trying to bridge this potential impact towards our consumers. I think we are inviting them to donate to the same projects that we are supporting. And it is great to see how much interest there are for the impact that is created in these individual projects, but also how much support we have seen from consumers in that space.
That's great. And I can just add, since I work with this Climate Transformation Fund that Klarna is supporting, is trying to be a solution for the step number 4 in the blueprint, supporting the solutions needed to reach global net zero. So both permanent carbon removal, but also restoring and protecting nature and investing into policy change and decarbonization more broadly. And it's something that's also open for other companies or individuals who want to support it. So if you're interested, you're welcome to get in touch later. So we heard from you, Carol, about IKEA and sort of how you view this, but it would be interesting to hear some more, and also about how you support climate outside your own value chain. You're doing quite a lot, actually, like hundreds of millions of dollars, but not everyone might know about that.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think the first part is, of course, as I said, priority is the value chain, and the value chain transition requires quite significant investment. So I think we need to acknowledge this one, and that's why it's so important to keep focus. But we know and we notice that we can do more. And for example, we invested 2.5 billion euro already within the renewable energy generation. And not all of this renewable electricity generation is connected to our consumption. So it's enabling as well additional beyond kind of affect our value chain. We committed 4 additional billion euro to invest by 2030. And the big focus is, of course, to increase the connection with the generation with our own value chain and enable the reduction of the emissions within the value chain. But there will be the part when we are enabling much bigger reduction going beyond. And it's not only renewable energy. We are within Inca, we are investing our profits as well in recycling infrastructure. And here the good example is coming from Netherlands. We know that circular economy, it's important part of creating net zero economy. And here we need to create much more circular flows. And they are not always directly connected to our value chain. And here, for example, in Netherlands, we invested in the company to enable that the same amount of mattresses as being disposed by people in Netherlands is being recycled. And this goes much more beyond recycling the IKEA mattresses, but it's actually all mattresses which are disposed on the market. And the other part is looking on the solutions. When we went into the journey when it comes to renewable electricity consumption, we saw like the opportunity, why not to engage with the customers? And we noticed as well when it comes to product use at home, of course, we are offering much more energy efficient lighting and only LED. And since we set science-based targets, on average, the energy efficiency of LED bulbs improved by 48%. But then we said, okay, but even if there will be more efficient LED, anyhow, there is remaining electricity use in people's homes. Plus, LEDs are just small part of consumption within the people's homes. So what if we will start to collaborate to enable the service to install PV panels on people's rooftops and to scale up the renewable energy generation by individuals. And this, of course, included as well the advocacy to increase like possibilities within the different markets and make it the renewable electricity generation by the many much more affordable and accessible. So these are just a couple of the examples, and what I mentioned, the advocacy, it's important part. We are not including the IKEA Foundation work within our corporate targets, so this is very important. So Inca Group is the only donor to IKEA Foundation, and for example, IKEA Foundation committed 1 billion euro to support the transition to renewable electricity, which is not connected to our corporate goals on going beyond. And I think this is why it's so important that we are having this discussion to clarify actually which parts of the company's actions should be accounted as a part of going beyond.
There's also, when comparing companies, then it's good for everyone to know at least what's happening outside sort of your own statements and your own reports, since it's a share of profit in your case where it goes from IKEA, or maybe it's all the profit. I don't exactly know how it works, but contributing to IKEA Foundation and these kind of products.
Yeah. So it's part of the profit that goes on an annual basis. Yeah.
So that's interesting, and sort of thinking about Scarlett's slides and sort of the third option there, the share of profit. This is sort of, it's happening already with companies like IKEA, but it's not framed in that way currently.
Yeah,
that's an interesting example.
And it's interesting, if I can just add, like connecting back to what Scarlett presented, actually, that maybe the way forward, it's about setting the number of indicators that companies should start to report the going beyond part. And then by taking different actions, but actually showing and proving through the right set of KPIs, what's the added value of these actions.
Yeah, that's good suggestion. Great. So moving on to Sarah and Gold Standard. You're an actor that's very vocal on these issues, and also changing a lot of the ways that you work and updating standards, and so looking at how carbon markets and corporate climate finance should evolve. I'm interested in hearing your reflections around the whole beyond value chain mitigation and how corporates can contribute in the best way.
Yeah, I like what Carol just mentioned in looking at KPIs on where you're investing the fee. And we're looking at new ways to do that. Of course, we think the voluntary carbon market can continue to play this role. Everyone on the webinar has already noted that it's important to use quality instruments. But there's also new ways that we're looking at. We talk about investing back into the value chain. Sometimes that's not so simple when sourcing is not so obvious, where data is not available. So Gold Standard has launched with the partner SustainCert, the Value Change Initiative, which allows companies to introduce interventions in their value chain and get credit for those reductions, even if they aren't, for example, sourcing all of the commodities if we're looking upstream. So there's important ways that we can look at verifying that impact to make sure that the money that is invested is actually achieving what it's meant to. A second example is it's actually out for public consultation now, is looking at fund level certification. So portfolio approaches, going from project level to larger scale and how companies could participate in contributing to these larger funds, where you're not necessarily issuing carbon credits at the end of the day, of course, but you have a claim that can be made and reported against your, these mitigation outcomes. So there's a lot that's new. We're trying to provide, opportunities for scale, but still make things simple so that even companies that are just coming along, starting their climate journey, have multiple avenues to pursue. And not only those climate leaders that we're fortunate to hear from and we have the trail blazed by them, but that we're establishing some kind of accessible solutions that any company could participate in. So I'd say so innovation on that side is really important. I think sometimes, you might be investing in a certain, in a place for innovation where you're not certain of the outcome, and that's okay. But we do think that a minimum bar should be to take full responsibility for all of your emissions. We heard from, Klarna articulate that very clearly. So I think that's the starting point, making sure that you're taking full responsibility for your entire impact through innovative solutions with verified outcomes. And then you might be creating enabling solutions, as Brad mentioned, or other innovations that are not yet proven, to build, to go from there. So I think that blended approaches can certainly work here. It's not a one size fits all solution.
Oh, thank you very much. So maybe let's jump from that to, because you talked about how we can get sort of a broad number of companies to contribute, and not just the ones that have significant resources in doing research and sort of spending a lot of time and money and energy on these issues. Let's talk about it in the whole panel. Like, how can companies be incentivized to support this kind of beyond value chain mitigation external climate projects? And connected to that is also the question of claims. But let's start with the sort of general question about incentivizing companies. What is needed in your opinion? Just opening it up for anyone. Don't be shy.
Yeah, I can take it again if nobody's no.
Go ahead.
I think no doubt regulations are playing key important role. The more regulations are pushing, then I think we are getting the bigger scale of actions and more companies being engaged. Then the second part is, of course, the customers and we see that people care and want to take actions. And the more we see the needs coming from the customers, this is accelerating the action for sure. And then the transparency, it's a very important part. And the more transparency we have, I think people start to look, like companies are looking on each other because the business is about competition. And today, within today's world, not only financial indicators are being source of a competition and being relevant on the market. So the more we have aligned frameworks and comparison between the companies, we can start to have CEOs in the same rooms discussing how many they are spending on which kind of actions to accelerate.
I like that idea, the CEOs sort of sparring against each other. So Scarlett, you talked to a lot of companies as part of this research. What's your view on sort of incentivization part?
So yeah, we kind of came up with a set of things that we think will incentivize companies. So the first is that they have to understand the science. So I think many people, when you say to them, and this was talked about earlier, but you say, oh, well, I've got my science-based target, like, isn't that enough? And I think many people don't quite recognize that, well, we know that the nationally determined contributions under Paris aren't enough. And we know that, in most sectors, it's still, a small percentage of companies that have actually set science-based targets. So there's a huge ambition gap, both at a country level and a corporate level. So they need to recognize that, yeah, science-based targets are the minimum you have to do. It is not kind of what's necessary in order to get to global net zero. I think they need to understand, and I think climate scientists are doing very well on this now, but the communication around the impacts of climate change is a much clearer than it was a decade ago or so. But still, it's often talked about at quite a high level, and maybe we need much more sort of business specific business cases, other businesses talking about how much, their profits are being eroded as a result of climate change or the impacts that it's having on the business. We think they need a claim, very important, particularly consumer facing organizations. Like, why would you buy a carbon credit unless you, unless you're regulated to, obviously then it's a compliance market, or unless you're able to make a claim on it, or you truly are doing it for a benevolent reason, then you might invest in climate philanthropy instead. So the claim is so critical. I think we need more of a mobilization engine as well. I mean, there's lots of initiatives like the Race to Zero and the SBTI that are doing that, but there's not so many that are very focused on beyond value chain mitigation. And then finally, I think we need the transparency infrastructure. So, there's far too many companies that are claiming one thing but doing something else. And I don't blame a lot of those companies actually, because it's so complicated. All the language is really complicated. So many companies are doing things thinking it's the right thing, only to then be called out later. So I just think much more like clarity about what the claim is, much more standardization of terminology, and much more kind of transparency, pointing to where companies are doing good things, and obviously calling out companies when they're saying one thing and doing something else.
Thank you very much.
But actually, maybe one other thing. I mean, the one big thing that companies did say was that they wanted somebody, potentially the SBTI, to create a sort of similar, in the way that they do for emission reduction and neutralization targets, that actually have kind of a target that they could sign up to and be recognized for.
Yeah, with benchmarks perhaps and those kind of things. So yeah, claims are important. Yeah, let's go for Derek first before.
Yeah, I guess just picking up on that point, right? I think the part of the tension with this, maybe this new paradigm, I guess, that we're struggling with is, that balance between this claim, a consumer-facing claim, and sorting out what all that means in the context of getting to net zero. And is it a claim like carbon neutrality or achieving net zero that needs to be there? And I can kind of understand that perspective from the consumer point of view. This nice kind of two-word encapsulation of what companies are doing, but at the same time, that can elide a lot of the differences between like what Brad and others were talking about, how much you're relying on BBCM versus that the science-based target. And so figuring out a way to frame corporate action, I think that orients it towards contributing to the global outcome that we need to get to, and whether that's a philanthropic kind of point of view or focusing on the impacts rather than the claims. I think that could be more constructive, but I think the challenge we have is how to distill that down to something that's going to resonate with companies and their customers in a voluntary context that's not being driven by regulatory pressure, for example. Yeah, definitely. Brad, you want to continue the?
Yeah, I think this is the biggest question we get about the blueprint. They look at it and they say, well, can I claim carbon neutral with this? What can I say? Like, what is the two-worded claim? And there is not one claim that can easily be associated with what's happening here, right? I mentioned in the chat, I was actually answering this question as, in the Q&A section. I was answering this while Derek was speaking. And what I said there is that some have used the term climate positive to describe the strategy that they might have here. That it is also used in sort of a compensation type of way too, where you're investing at least, or you're offsetting maybe more than 10% of your value chain emissions and going beyond in that way. I think that's usually the way climate positive has been used, or carbon positive has been used. But I have seen some associated with something like the blueprint. Another one that's I've seen recently is climate optimal or climate optimized, as a sort of way that sort of hints at the mitigation hierarchy. but I, like Derek was saying, we might try to move away from those headline claims if we can to some degree. And I think Klarna, the way that they've described, are putting forth the projects, right, within their messaging and talking about what these projects are doing is quite compelling too, right? So yeah, there's another way to tell the story beyond just using the headline claim, recognizing that I know that that's what a lot of companies and marketing teams are certainly looking for.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So let's move on to Emily and the question about what should corporate support, what kind of climate projects are the best, and we heard a little bit about it already from Brad and the presentation of the blueprint, that it can go to different ways, different types of projects, and the needs might differ. And Giving Green is doing research, looking at sort of, yeah, what are the most effective climate projects. And so definitely interested in hearing your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, as a lot of folks have already said, I think it's the one thing that we really believe is that you have to go beyond just this idea of offsetting your carbon emissions. And climate change is a systemic problem, as we all know, and that really means to us that you have to be investing in policy change or technology change, or like the combination thereof. And this is something that obviously other panelists have spoken about, going into things like R&D for carbon removal or climate finance or enabling conditions in a broad sense. And when we say policy change, I think we're really thinking like direct policy change efforts. If you're in the US, like a 501c3, a charity, we really think that companies can be looking beyond this idea of purchasing a credit to really fund these organizations that are working to directly ask the government to do better, to create the regulations that will force all the other companies to come along. And we've seen companies that we work with and otherwise do this. You have Klarna investing in the Milkywire portfolio or Giving Green's portfolio, both of which include that combination of not only policy change organizations, activist organizations, think tanks, things like that, but also some really high quality carbon credits. And I think to this point about claims, I mean, this stuff isn't always measurable. It might not always work, but we've done some internal cost effectiveness analyses. It's hard to quantify these, but to the best that we can figure out, if you invest in things like policy change, activist groups, think tanks, policy making, that's at least an order of magnitude more impactful than your best carbon avoidance or removal credits per dollar. And so if you're taking like a dollar for ton or dollar for dollar approach and you have some amount of money that you can invest, why not look to where you can make the most impact with that money? And that's, we think, not going to be in carbon credits. Some folks do both, right? Like mitigation and then offsetting all of their emissions and then going beyond and donating to some of these groups. And I think that's really one of the best combinations you can get. But ultimately, it's about, to us, how you can make that impact with the amount of resources you have. And not all of us, I know like on this call, I'm sure not all of the folks here are able to make that decision to donate to policy. And in that case, you do have really high quality carbon credits, as other folks have talked about, where there's really a causal path from your purchase to the removal of emissions. But I think overall, we'd say that you should really be looking to go beyond carbon credits in that sense.
Thank you. And it's a different sort of perspective where you would look at the expected value, right? Not just sort of what you know would happen, but taking, riskier bets when the payoff would be really high. So it's really interesting to see this kind of well-founded research also, but also sort of looking at the companies that are trying to do it and seeing how it can be done in many different ways. And the needs are in different types of different areas. Just another question that has come up in the presentations is how much. And Scarlett, you had calculations on that and sort of showing where different scenarios lead you to different types of climate finance contributions. And it's interesting because, as noted, different companies have very different capabilities, and like banks or like insurance companies or software companies sometimes have profits that are hundreds of thousands of dollars per ton emitted in all scopes. Even like some of the biggest banks in Sweden have that, for example, that we've seen. And so they could probably pay a lot, but others who are in a heavy emitting industry might not be able to pay that much per ton emitted. What's your thoughts around that? Leaving it open to the panel.
I can.
Sarah is, yeah.
Yeah, I'll share some reflections. Sorry. Yeah, Sarah? Yeah, great. I'll share some reflections, but I think it's clear that it isn't a cut and dry answer. I mean, I don't think we've seen anyone comment yet that there's a price below $40 per ton that seems material enough to provide that sufficient incentive to further reduce emissions. I think a few things are important when setting up the fee. One is making individual business units and decision makers accountable, so that this isn't just a top-down exercise or something that's done in the sustainability department, but that there is accountability and education throughout the organization, so it's internalized. I also think it's important for it to increase year on year. Again, not 100%, cut and dry what that increase looks like. There also could be regional approaches, in Europe, for example, benchmarking against the ETS, but then that has its own challenges of volatility. But at least referencing benchmarks like the ETS as they change over time. So those are some principles, though I think it's not easy to land on the answer.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to weigh in on the how much question? Otherwise, we can move on to what should be the minimum requirements. So regardless, Brad, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I think one thing that Carol said earlier is with a lot of these things, it would be great to have some sort of standardized disclosure of what companies are doing. And then from there, you can start to see trends, you can start to learn about the best practices in a way. And I think with a lot of things, even just encouraging disclosure, you'll start to see the different types of carbon prices out there that some companies are using, right? And I think that would be just a wealth of information for companies that are looking to benchmark. And again, you're going to see that sort of stratification from the companies that are using $100 a ton versus $20 a ton, et cetera. So I think that would be, a nice thing to see.
Yeah, definitely. Scarlett, you raised your hand.
Maybe the only other thing to add, I mean, there's lots of research at the moment going on about what the sort of carbon prices how they will change over time, and see they're deemed to be kind of artificially low at the moment. They don't necessarily take into account things like the opportunity cost of land use. So everybody is expecting the cost of carbon credits to move up towards that sort of $40-50 a ton over the coming years. So I think companies can't rely just on a sort of a $5 cheap carbon offset.
No, that's for sure. Carol.
Yeah, and adding to this conversation, I think as a Science-Based Targets Initiative done well as well by changing the name a bit of carbon compensation to going beyond and opening up this discussion, because it's clear that it cannot be about buying the cheapest credits, because what it matters the most is, as Emily mentioned, is a systemic change. So what are the big impacts activities that companies can take in addition to taking part of the emissions within the value chain? And sometimes, yes, maybe as Emily as well mentioned, some of them maybe are not possible to even quantify within the CO2 impacts, but they are very much needed to enable this transition and collective reaching of net zero, as it was mentioned at the beginning by Derek, that it is a systemic net zero. So we need to take responsibility for our value chain, and then we need to contribute wider. But yeah, so I think this price part, it is maybe something what we still need to discuss it and leave a bit the only certificate behind and say, like, what are the needed actions, and look into what is coming to my mind now. It's UN climate change pathways for the sectors, when within the pathway for your sector, you can find the actions that you need to take as well beyond the value chain. So maybe there is some opportunity actually to take a look from the sectoral perspective, what is beyond means for your sector as well.
Yeah. And I think the question on sort of minimum requirements were touched upon by Brad with the transparency, companies reporting on what they're doing, what kind of projects they're supporting, how much they're spending on beyond value chain mitigation. So I want to go into the Q&A. We've got lots of questions. So any other final sort of remarks on the issues that we discussed so far? So you want to address before going to the Q&A? And please rewrite your question in the Q&A if you only wrote it in the chat and you still want it answered. I think that's, we probably won't have time for all the questions, but there at least we can see them. So yeah, there's a lot of questions to go into. So and you can help out, Brad and Derek, and
yeah, I mean, I think since you've been moderating, there's a few that we might, some of us that have had more time to look at the chat, we can suggest to you. I'm seeing one from anonymous attendee, written at the 47th minute of the hour. That's 7:47 a.m. my time, but I'm on the West Coast, so it's going to be different for you. But the claims companies can make and are in such a large role in motivating these actions. Have there been any learnings from Klarna or others so far in how to easily communicate these efforts when marketing around carbon neutrality and net zero is so, when the marketing around carbon neutrality and net zero is so varied? So I think it's another question about claims, but maybe more specifically directed at Klarna. So wondering if there's anything there that you want to address, Janne?
Yeah, for sure. Let me share our climate report here in the chat so everybody can check that out, because I've seen a few questions around that as well. For our own claims, I think I mentioned our decarbonization target already. I think we also pledged to being net zero in 2040. But aside from that, we did not make any near-term pledges. And I think this leaves us really the freedom to invest the capital that we are gathering through the internal carbon tax into projects that we feel like is or are most catalytic in each and every year. And in the last year, I think we have heard this already, we invested into a few carbon removal service companies, as well as into decarbonization and policy and advocacy groups. And this year, we really plan to do the same and double down on that. And what we still need to address is really that gap between now and our net zero pledge in 2040. But I think we are more focused on really creating impact with what we have right now, other than to come up with a near-term pledge that we want to get to for ourselves.
Thank you.
I hope that answered the question.
I saw one question in the chat earlier, though. Now I'm going away from the principle. But when should companies start thinking about adaptation instead of mitigation? Now we're talking about mitigation projects, reducing emissions, removing emissions. But is there a role for companies to also support adaptation projects? Scarlett and Sarah.
Yeah. So this was one of the things I was thinking through when we were looking at the kind of the 1.5% for climate mitigation. One of the issues with it was like, why not then include like another % for adaptation and then another % for poverty alleviation? Like, where do you draw the line? I didn't come to a clear conclusion on that, but I mean, one thing I would say on adaptation and resilience is that we do know that a lot of the nature-based solutions, which have very significant mitigation potential, also have huge benefits in terms of resilience and adaptation. So, you know, that is a very clear way that companies can start to think about prioritizing some of these investments Of course, we need lots of finance going into new technologies that are going to be important for carbon removal in the future. But we also very immediately need to protect the carbon sinks that might turn into sources, create horrible tipping points. And if you do that, then you also have all these other benefits in terms of kind of freshwater cycling and investing in mangroves has huge benefits in terms of coastal resilience. So there are lots of these kind of win-wins for both mitigation and adaptation that can help prioritize.
Sorry,
Yeah,
jump in as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I'm glad the question came up. I mean, I think Brad noted that we're talking about climate, nature, and people. It's really important that when you think about climate action, we don't have blinders on and we're looking just for a mitigation outcome, just cutting carbon. So even in those high value potential in NBS, there are also risks there. So it's really important to choose projects to support, whether it's adaptation, it's an adaptation impact led, or there's a mitigation project that has adaptation co-benefits, that all of the safeguards are managed well, stakeholders are engaged properly. So I think this points back to my original comment that I made, which it's critical that companies look at holistic approaches and make leverage the most from their kind of climate finance to avoid negative impact and also maximize the positive for people and for nature. So I think, again, I'd like to reiterate that I think it's important that companies should take full responsibility for their emissions, but then looking at that beyond, we've talked about the carbon credit price being lower than what we would put than the fee that would be levied, and contributing to adaptation and holistic approaches is a great opportunity to invest that.
Thank you. And Derek, you want to jump in?
Yeah,
as well?
not to belabor the point too long, but I think this discussion does point to, like, I think if we're going to be talking about adaptation, it does suggest we are reorienting the conversation towards philanthropic approaches, right? It's not the compensation model. And my mind goes back to an example from, 15 years ago, where some folks were exploring this idea of adaptation credits, and there was a portfolio of adaptation options they were talking about, but one of them was, swimming lessons for children in Bangladesh, right? And it's the optics there were not great to sort of compensate for your emissions by paying for kids to be able to swim when it floods. So one has to be careful there. But I think, with that appropriate caveat aside, what Sarah and Scarlett were talking about makes a lot of sense.
Mm. And you want to continue, Scarlett?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, there was this basically levy that went from the cost of the credits into this adaptation fund. That could potentially be an idea for voluntary carbon markets as well, that you have a similar, like a flat levy on top that goes to adaptation. I don't know if that's something that has been considered in the context of things like the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative or the Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets or anything like that, but it's an idea.
Yeah, and Scarlett, actually, Article 6 has a similar provision. Our standard is looking at that, the OMGE, the overall mitigation generation potential. Yeah, sorry, I'm butchering that, but making sure that there's more reductions than claimed, and also that there's contributions to adaptation. It's not part of our standard yet, but it's something that our technical advisory committee is looking at.
Yeah. And there are also some questions about the role of the voluntary carbon market, sort of in this moving forward. It's a structure that exists already and sort of can be utilized. So what's your thoughts on that?
Personally, I think it's a fantastic way to allow many participants to contribute without having to develop bespoke programs. So I think the voluntary carbon market has a lot of potential to innovate here in, you know, traditional methodologies that have new claims, but also in verified impact towards many different outcomes, to adaptation, to conservation, etc. I think we've looked too narrowly at you know, we've had just this carbon offset, carbon credit, carbon neutrality, and I think we can be a much more imaginative and use it for much greater impact.
Brad and Derek.
Yeah, I'll add to that, and this is sort of around the theme and question from one of the attendees about if there's actually a risk with the blueprint itself, with encouraging companies to spend money on things that might not deliver an impact, or it doesn't have a verified impact. And I'll admit that this is one potential risk. There is a potential double-edged sword here. I think that this framework is for actors who want to do good. You could see that an actor that would want to game this could use it and game this, right? If they want to claim their R&D on, algae biofuels, which they've been doing research on for the last 20 or 30 years, if they want to claim investment in that as beyond value chain mitigation spending, that would be sort of a way to game the system in a sense. I also worry a little bit about the newer sort of programs that are delivering ex post mitigation outcomes that are not going through the carbon crediting standards like gold standard. And so, I mean, there's a particular opportunity in some cases with those things that they might be able to scale a little bit faster, but I would recommend if it's not going through a carbon crediting standard, which has had, a lot of these standards have had decades to evolve, to do extra due diligence on that, because I worry about some of the newer projects that are sort of using novel approaches that have been discussed for years in the voluntary carbon market, and are presenting them sort of as new when they're not, right? So yeah, there's a particular risk there that I think we have to acknowledge. And so I think that companies should just really be thinking about doing a lot of due diligence on bespoke things that they might invest in.
Yeah. Derek.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Brad, that's right. That concern I have, I guess, from many years in the voluntary carbon market is it's not always easy to, even if you are well-intentioned and you're not trying to game the system, to understand what kinds of mitigation investments are really going to have an impact. Every project developer is going to say this is a great additional project, and so how do you make those? How do you discriminate? And it's because of that I would be hesitant to too quickly abandon the architecture that the gold standard and others have worked for years to establish, to really kind of provide that kind of certification, especially for buyers who may not have the resources to do all the due diligence. But I think what we're talking about here kind of opens up new vistas for where the voluntary that architecture could go, and maybe it's not so much the cheap industrial gas destruction. I mean, nobody's doing that now, but the cheap stuff, focusing more on the high value stuff. And I think building off what we have, we can reorient towards the kinds of things that WWF is talking about in their blueprint in terms of what should be that priority.
Yeah. So there's another question I thought was interesting. There's overlap in scope 3 emissions, that there are other companies scope 2 and 1 emissions, and is this a risk that you have overlap of carbon emissions, that it would undermine the importance of mitigation of scope 3 emissions? An audience question here. Should it be too much compensated? I think that's the way to interpret the question. Carol.
Yeah, looking on the scope 3 and overlaps, actually what we see is an opportunity, because it's bringing companies much closer to cooperate on the same issue. And then we can assume that the solution will come faster as well. And I believe we don't see yet full potential of the scope 3 when data will underline all the market in a way, and will bring the companies and public sector and cities and individuals much more closer to collaborate to reduce emissions. Then I think we will see much more systemic change happening based on this collaboration, because we are facing the same challenge at the end, and we are coming from this silo mode. And that's why I think so often we hear that we need to move from egocentric to ecosystem thinking leadership, because we need to collaborate. And I think, yeah, scope 3 is a big enabler, so I see more as a benefit on that one.
Scarlett and then Emily.
Yeah, completely agree with what Carol said. I mean, I think scope, yeah, one of the approaches that you could take is you could have a lower social cost of carbon for scope 3 if you were worried about too much compensation, but that's certainly not something that keeps me up at night. The other thing I wanted to say is just on data for scope 3. I mean, I think some of you might have seen that SBTi have said that now by 2050, companies have to be getting, I think it was 90 or 95% coverage of their scope 3 emissions within their targets, which is a big increase. And companies are, worried about that, because we all know how difficult it is to collect some of that scope 3 data. But we're seeing huge developments in the kind of data infrastructure, like different types of monitoring systems, etc. So it's a space I'm really personally very excited about. And I know I used to do lots of greenhouse gas reporting for big companies, so I do know how burdensome it is. But I also think it's a unique opportunity to actually understand your business properly. So it's not just kind of reporting for reporting's sake, it's understanding where you're sourcing from, what impacts that's having, what dependencies you have on those sourcing landscapes, etc. So trying to look at it more as an opportunity as opposed to a kind of burden. But very exciting data digitization stuff going on.
Yeah. And Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those are really good points. And I think scope 3 emissions obviously is going to create more opportunities for collaboration, more opportunities for deeper mitigation and offsetting, or whatever we'd like to call it. I would also say that I've also never liked scope 3 emissions as a tool. And I think, not to belabor the point, but we don't need to be thinking only about our emissions, right? And just offsetting what we've calculated to be our scope 3 emissions. I think there's room for that in incentivizing companies to do better, and I think that's a good thing. But in areas that are not climate, when companies do social responsibility on other things like racial justice, let's say, or like helping folks be lifted out of poverty or things like that, you don't quantify that by the way that it offsets your emissions in some way, or offsets the amount of people you've affected with your company. You see it as a good thing in its own right. And I think there's a lot of room for climate projects to be treated the same way and marketed the same way.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we're almost out of time. Is there any question or something that any of the panelists wants to bring up that we haven't mentioned or covered? This is the last chance now. We have, of course, lots of questions that we weren't able to answer. Yeah, Carol.
Yeah, I think the question about that we should look into the going beyond less as a risk and more as an opportunity, I think definitely, because as a companies, we know the situation is changing and you need to look for innovation, and companies can adjust even to their investors and say why they are investing so much into specific projects to be relevant within the net zero economy. So there is definitely opportunity to define going beyond as a business opportunity, as adjusting the company's business model to be relevant in net zero economy, which can create much bigger financial flow. And especially with in connection to existing TCFD framework, which gives the great link to that.
Yeah. Derek, you'll get the last word.
I noted a comment in the chat, I think it was from Nisha, saying that we need a support group for corporate sustainability officers. And I sympathize 100%. It's easy for some of us, especially me in a think tank, to be tossing around all these ideas, but I understand the practical challenges. And I think it just goes to the fact that this is an ongoing sort of reorientation and conversation. I don't think we have all the answers yet. But especially coming back to, what is it companies are doing? How do we communicate that? How do we come up with sort of an agreed kind of consensus on what responsible corporate voluntary climate action looks like and how to communicate that? Those are the big challenges going forward. So, understand.
Definitely, and it's all very new. Sort of this approach, or some of it is old, but it's also a lot of changes happening, and it's very exciting to be discussing all these issues. And looking forward to many more discussions. And big thanks to all of you, speakers and panelists, and to everyone in the audience as well. I think this was a very good discussion and lots of interesting questions. So hopefully there will be a lot more of that. Maybe we can leave the webinar open for a few minutes so we can just see if there's anything urgent to address in the chat, but otherwise we're done for today. Thank you.